All right, so corrupted millionaire coal baron Joe Manchin is back at it again, this time basically going to an energy conference where he decided to rail against the possibility of us making substantial investments towards renewable energies or towards specifically electric vehicle and charging stations for the United States to help facilitate the transition to renewables and away from fossil fuels. And so I wanted to read to you guys exactly what he had to say at this conference, because I think this is a perfect insight into how conservatives are using the ongoing Russian invasion of Ukraine and the spike in oil and gas prices that we have seen recently, using this as an opportunity to disingenuously push for a doubling down on horrendous fossil fuels that are only going to facilitate the destruction of the planet via climate change, as well as not actually solving the problem with American energy independence as they are trying to claim that it is. So let's just go ahead and get into this. They say, while offering measured support for the U.S. energy transition, U.S. Senator Joe Manchin said on March 11th that he was reluctant to support the proliferation of electric vehicles due to their over-reliance on foreign supply chains. Okay, let's continue here. He said, quote, "I'm very reluctant to go down the path of electric vehicles," Manchin said. "I'm old enough to remember standing in line in 1974 trying to buy gas. I remember those days. I don't want to have to be standing in line waiting for a battery for my vehicle because we're now dependent on a foreign supply chain, mostly China." So, okay, he basically just pointed out a direct contradiction with what he was just saying up here, right? His criticism is that, well, we can't move towards renewable energies, we can't move towards electric vehicles because then we will be beholden to a foreign supply chain, whether it's, China or any other countries that have a greater access to like lithium stores or whatever is necessary to build electric vehicles, etc. So he's saying we shouldn't switch to electric vehicles, we shouldn't switch to renewable energy because we'll be more reliant on countries like China for those energy systems to be maintained. Meanwhile, the one example that he gave as a criticism of renewable energies is directly pointing to a gas crisis from 1974 that was specifically caused because of our reliance on foreign supply chains for fossil fuels. Okay, so the problem that he's saying would come about if we switch to renewable energies, he is literally describing down here is a problem that exists right now with our current fossil fuel-based organization of our energy systems. So again, just completely refuting his own point here, using an actual example of a gas crisis that was created in 1974 by a handful of countries in the Middle East deciding to create an artificial embargo as a protest to a war that was happening. And they created this embargo, artificially restricted the supply of oil to the international market, and that caused gas prices to go up as we're seeing right now. So again, this is an artificial shortage being created by a Middle East oil cartel. Does that sound familiar? Because that's exactly what the fuck is happening right now. Okay, we're seeing the rise in gas prices happening right now as a direct result of the problem that Joe Manchin is claiming would happen if we switch to renewable energies. So like you can't get more stupid than this at face value. Okay, he's directly contradicting himself here. Now, this doesn't even get into, the ridiculous nature of who Joe Manchin is ideologically on economics specifically, or who, neoliberals in over the last number of decades, essentially since Ronald Reagan, have been pushing for expansion of U.S. investments overseas and pushing American jobs overseas to countries like China, for example, to basically exploit cheap labor in all of these other countries around the world so they didn't have to pay Americans to manufacture these goods here domestically. Okay, so this is a problem that was created by corrupt politicians like Joe Manchin over the last number of decades, like Joe Biden, for example. There's another one right there. Plenty of those within the Democratic and Republican parties that have spent the last decades, increasing our reliance on foreign supply chains, basically just to appease the interests of U.S. multinational corporations. So again, it's corrupt motherfuckers like you that are responsible for the exporting of our manufacturing overseas in the first place. So how are you going to turn around and then pretend as if this was just some crisis that happened because, we got dicked over? No, you guys sold out the American people to U.S. multinational corporations to go exploit cheap labor around the world. That's what happened. This is your fault and the fault of your ideology that you are continuing to push right now. And understand, the most important part of this is understand, Joe Manchin does not want an increase in domestic manufacturing here, or an increase to, oil drilling or fracking here because he wants to support the American people. He could give a shit about average American workers or average Americans within his own home state of West Virginia. We've seen this demonstrated over and over and over again by his complete refusal to agree to sign on to any social programs that would actually materially improve people's lives. So he obviously doesn't give a shit about average, West Virginia constituents that he pretends to, but his actual interest here isn't in lowering the cost for the American people on oil and gas or using our, domestic supply here. His priority here is giving more control to U.S. multinational corporations to use our domestic resources that we have here. We, again, reminder, export our natural gas, we export oil. He wants to give them more power, more, unregulated markets to take our natural resources from the United States and export them to the global market so that corporations that Joe Manchin himself directly profits from and, companies that he directly has a financial stake in and takes bribes from on a regular basis, he wants to serve their interests. He wants to increase the amount that they are able to bring in profits. And how is that happening? It's happening by what we're seeing right now. U.S. corporations working in tandem with countries like Saudi Arabia and other OPEC nations like Russia, who are working in coordination right now to artificially restrict the supply of oil and gas into the markets so that they can make fatter profit margins. And how fat are those profit margins? Well, here from Common Dreams, they say, biggest oil giants made an eye-popping $205 billion in profits in 2021. $205 billion in, important word here, profits, okay? Profits, meaning not, their supply side, costs went up and they have no choice but to raise the cost of gas. No, they're artificially raising the cost of gas so that the American consumer, so that average working class Americans have to front the cost to basically increase the amount they are able to divvy out to their shareholders or the amount that they are able to use for buybacks to drive up their stock prices, okay? So it's just a giant racket. I mean, this is essentially a mafia who is shaking down the American people to increase their profit margins. It's pretty clear what's happening right now. So I think Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had a good take on the personal corruption side of this in relation to Joe Manchin, because again, he's not principled in any sense of the word. He doesn't, want to lower costs for the American people. He just wants to serve the corporations that he has a direct financial stake in and who funnel money into his campaign to keep him in his position of power. So here's what she had to say. Truly bizarre how in Washington it's totally allowed and acceptable to accept hundreds of thousands in fossil fuel money plus own millions in fossil fuel investments while brazenly killing clean energy policy. But what's not acceptable is raising that fact and questioning that connection. And of course, she says the same goes for pretty much every other industry here in the United States, big pharma, Wall Street, etc., etc. And she's absolutely right there. Okay, this is not just unique to like fossil fuel companies. Again, you see this in the healthcare industry. You see this in even our transportation industries. Every single industry here within the United States, very few that would be exception to this rule, are completely privatized, are handed over to corporations to operate for profit and at the expense of average workers and at the expense of the country as a whole, because we aren't seeing an aggressive transition towards renewable energy that will have disastrous effects on climate change, as well as continuing to keep us dependent on the very same foreign supply chains that Joe Manchin is claiming to rail against in that. And again, another picture here, Joe Manchin has made $5.2 million from his coal company that his son now has the ownership stake in and gets big donations from fossil fuel industry. So again, this is why, okay, this is why Joe Manchin is pushing against investments in renewable technology and investments in electric vehicles, etc. It's not because he wants to lower costs for the American people. It's because he wants to raise the profits of the companies that he has a direct financial stake in. So, not really fooling anybody. It's pretty fucking obvious what's happening here. Also, just as a fun fact, Joe Manchin happens to sit on the committee within Congress, within the Senate, that gets to vote on climate legislation. So, millionaire coal baron is, getting to go out and decide the fates of billions of people around the planet in relation to climate change by essentially refusing to allow any reasonable steps to be taken to do anything that could possibly hurt his own personal bottom line.